What's going on, guys? Welcome back to WWE Network and Show, where I, Graham G.S. Matthews, break down all the original content I watch on the WWE Network and on Peacock and on Vice. As today we're talking Season 5, Episode 5 of Dark Side of the Ring on the life and legends of Harley Race. Now, this was from not this past week, but the week before that during WrestleMania week. Didn't have a chance to watch it before leaving for Philadelphia, so I'm watching it now, reviewing it now. A good episode. There was a lot about Harley Race, and this is typically the case with every episode of the show they do, because I'm a wrestling historian to a certain extent. When it comes to this sort of stuff, I really don't know nearly as much as others. So these shows and episodes really help out a lot, kind of filling in the blanks and stuff like that. Harley Race, obviously an established legend in wrestling, but there was a lot in this episode they discuss that kind of made me look at him a bit differently by the time it was over. His place in wrestling history will never be disputed as one of the greatest of all time, but as a person, clearly a piece of shit. Now, he was not nearly as bad as some other people we've seen profiled on this show, but he's done a lot of, pretty despicable stuff, specifically beating his wife, that whole shit. We hear from his ex-wife here on the show, so it wasn't just like hearsay. We hear from her own mouth what happened, her own experience being married to Harley, and she even says, oh, he was a kind man, he was nice, and all this other sort of stuff. But, she kind of reiterated multiple times that he threatened her if she ever left, and it was bad enough where she had a fucking restraining order against him at one point. That's pretty bad. Anyway, so they open up the episode. Jim Cornette talks about his toughness, Harley Race's toughness, and how he always made it look like he was legitimately hurting people, and I'm sure he was, but not as much as it looked like he was in the ring. They talk about how he had a work ethic from a very young age, and we hear from his childhood friend, and I don't know how the fuck they tracked this guy down, but because Harley was, 76 when he died, and that was a couple of years ago. This guy's probably 80 now. He was pretty old, but they talk about how he let people, Harley that is, he let other kids punch him in the stomach, and that was kind of a testament to his toughness even back then. He left home at 14. They talked about how he was tortured by the Zbyszko brothers. Any relation to Larry Zbyszko, I'm not sure, but they brought him in, and they kind of when I say tortured, it's hard to put into words, but it was one of those things where it was a really tough environment, and they really made him tough. But they talked about how he was tough even in third grade, so this was 14, 15, 16. So I guess it was the right environment for him because he didn't mind it, or he enjoyed a certain aspect of it, I guess. They talked about how he trained at the carnivals, and it was really dangerous for him. He worked for a guy named Gus Carras, I believe. And he had to cater, it was kind of like a manservant of sorts, I suppose you can say, to a guy named Happy Humphrey, who was 700 pounds. Even had to fucking bathe him, just disgusting. And that was kind of how he paid his dues. So he ended up getting married. His wife was pregnant. I thought they had the kid. They did not. I don't think anyway. She was pregnant at the time they got into a car accident. He was pretty badly fucked up. She died. She dies in the car accident. That very badly kind of messed with him, and probably did until the day that he died. He did remarry to the woman I mentioned earlier, the flight attendant. That's when they met. And he ended up beating her later on, like I said, but he barely survived. He barely survived the car accident. He almost lost his right leg in the process, actually. And that all happened on Christmas Eve, so he always hated Christmas and Christmas Eve from that point forward. But yeah, he met his second wife, a flight attendant. She talked about how he dyed his hair blonde for heat, and she didn't like that, and how she would always take her son Nathan to the movies if they knew that the match that he was going to be in that night was going to be bloody. They didn't want to watch the match, had nothing to do with it, if Dad was going to get bloody and beat the fuck up and stuff like that. They talked about how he brought a machine gun to a fan's house after seeing this man either beat a woman or his wife, which is ironic because, again, he did that to his own wife, or was at least, at the very least, very aggressive towards her. So I thought that was interesting. And the guy tried to stab him at ringside. And I don't know if that was the same incident, but this guy tried to stab him. He goes to that fan's house and brings a machine gun. They imply that he killed him, and they imply that the story is true per Trevor Murdoch. He may have just shot at the house. That's what I took from it. A very interesting story. The ex-wife talks about how he was only home about 3 times a month because he was that busy on the road. And he would always speed anyway, despite the car accident he was in. It didn't faze him at all. He still sped. Did whatever the fuck he wanted, really. Whether that be drinking or whatever. So he was teaming with Kurt Hennig at the time. He ended up going off on his own, becoming a single star, beating Dory Funk Jr., for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship in 1973. And they talk all about that. And how he was synonymous with that championship for the next decade, holding it a total of, from 73 to 83 anyway, like 7 or 8 times. So he really was synonymous with that championship for a very long time. A lot like John Cena was, from like 05 to 2015 with the WWE Championship. But, it really took a toll on his body. He wrestled 1-hour matches a lot. He had a very hectic road schedule, did not treat his wife well at all, she talks about. He ended up losing the championship, not during his first run, but like later on, 10 years later, to Ric Flair at Starrcade. And they tell the story about how he was offered $250,000, which is a lot of money now, but especially back then, probably, $1 million, $3 million? I don't know what the conversion rate would be, by Vince to not do the match and to just come to WWE or whatever. He ended up working for Vince soon after, but he turned that down, and as soon as he left the room, Vince was like on his hands and knees and grabbing him by the leg to not leave. That was the story they shared. And he also put Vince to sleep in that same interaction, they said. He brought a gun to Hulk Hogan because Hulk Hogan at that point was the world champion in WWE. And I guess he was jealous, like, oh, who's the real world champion? So he brought a gun to kind of like, not fuck him up, but like intimidate him, I guess, which was, again, definitely questionable. Cornette thinks that Vince thought that Harley Race was too plain, which is why he never really got an aggressive push in WWE. He was there for a little while. He was king of the ring. And they talked about how he probably hated the fucking gimmick because that just wasn't really who he was. But he worked with Hogan, actually. It was in a match against Hogan, interestingly enough, where he blew out his lower intestines on a table spot. And when his son found him in the son's apartment, when he came home or whatever, Harley was on like the fetal position, almost died. He had an abdominal hernia, an abdominal hernia, and almost killed him. Crippled his career from that point forward. He was never the same guy in the ring from that point forward. And they tell this story about how he was drinking while boating. I thought we were going down the Brutus Beefcake route here, where he gets in a boating accident, and technically he did. He ran into a boat that didn't have its lights on, and he resisted arrest when the cops showed up. Just a really bad situation. The wife, immediately following this incident, like that same night, called her psychiatrist, she said. The psychiatrist said, get the fuck away from him. She proceeds to call her lawyer and file for divorce and issue a restraining order against him. That's how bad it was. I mean, it must have been pretty bad when you go ahead and do something like that. So he didn't have to pay, she talked about how he didn't have to pay alimony for a 16-year-old that called and said, hey, I'm your kid. You got to pay alimony. Why are you just finding this out now? Blah, blah, blah. He got out of it. And when asked, the wife said, like, oh, how did he get out of it? The wife said, well, he is Harley Race. He was Harley Race. He can get out of anything. And she talked about how he threatened her when she wanted to leave at certain points. So again, if he wasn't flat out beating her, then he was at least very aggressive and abusive, which is not good. They talked about how he later on had to pay $250,000 on the accident, and the boating accident, because the person, when it went to court and it was years later, the woman was still in a wheelchair. They wanted like $10 million. They only ended up getting $250,000. But he had to pay that. So it really put whatever you want to call it, like an anchor in his career. All of his money, all the stuff that he bought and saved for, gone because he had to pay for this accident. So he ended up getting hired by WCW as a manager for Vader, and they thought they could use him in a meaningful role because he's a legend and people respected him. Ended up doing a 1999 expose on wrestling as far as, how wrestling works. And yeah, they blurred, quote-unquote, his identity by just blurring out his face or showing him in the shadows. It was pretty clear that it was Harley Race, though. And it didn't get him blackballed from the business because the guy that would be doing that sort of thing as far as issuing the blackball would be Harley Race, but he ended up doing that because he needed the money. That's how desperate he was. He got inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2004. He died at the age of 76, ultimately. I forgot what from. The ex-wife says that he was a good guy deep down, and people saw him as a wrestling god, which means that he could really get away with doing whatever he wanted. But he just wasn't meant to be a husband, she says. And a few other people like Cornette say that he gave more of himself to the business than anyone else ever has. And that was basically the episode. So I thought it was a good episode. It does make me look at Harley Race a bit differently, knowing that he was doing some of that shit like a fucking idiot Obviously a legend in the industry, but that's coming right from the ex-wife. That's pretty unfortunate and sad that she had to go through that sort of shit. So a good episode, not great. Certainly one of the more, I don't want to say tepid, but definitely one of the darker ones this season. It was one of those episodes where it was like, wow, he really did some of that shit. That's not good. So, an interesting episode. I'm looking forward to next week, or the most recent one, rather. I have not gotten around to watching yet. The Welcome to My Nightmare Chris Colt episode. I heard that was interesting. So, that aired this past week. My review of that should be up soon as well in the next few days. Keep an eye out for it. Thank you guys for checking out my latest Dark Side of the Ring review here on the channel. Way more Dark Side of the Ring reviews. I've reviewed every single episode in the last couple of years. All the reviews are down below in the description box, so check that out. Like the video, drop a comment, share the video, and subscribe to the channel for more daily content. Have an awesome one, guys. I'm Graham G. Matthews, and I'll catch your ass down the road.